So as I said, the topic of today is publishing ethics and integrity. And we are organizing it with Taylor and Francis. And when I say we, I mean Euraxis China. Um, I am here with these two colleagues of mine, and we represent Euraxis in China that has been in Beijing since 2009. So we have running our activities in China for quite a bit now. What we do is mainly working with researchers, both Chinese researchers and European researchers that are based in China. And we try to animate this network, this community of researchers by mainly creating a bridge, creating a link between Europe and China. So what we do for Chinese researchers is trying to present them and expose them to the opportunities what we call the European research area. That is this area forming like more than 40 different countries with different scientific programs. That is really like an excellent place where to do your science. So we provide information and we promote opportunities, especially for those Chinese researchers who are thinking and considering of pursuing a research career in the EU and in the European research area. We also work and have been working a lot with the European researchers who moved to China. So we organize events and information sessions for them to make sure that they are also taking advantage of the opportunities offered by this the Chinese landscape, and to also make sure that they stay connected to Europe. We are Euraxis China, but we are part of a larger initiative that is called Euraxis and is backed by the European Commission, so the main body of the European Union. And this Euraxis has different arms. There is Euraxis Europe arm, as we call it, that is composed by more than 600 different offices, service centers. They are in all the countries. They are part of the initiative. So those of you who are thinking or moving to those countries can find specific support for all the logistics, getting to know the local taxations and all the support you might need in moving to those countries. There is our web portal. Our Euraxis China's portal can be visited at china.euraxis.org. And that is also a very good place to start if you're looking for opportunities to continue your research career or to establish collaborations between your institution and your institution based in Europe. There's really thousands of jobs opportunities, and that's also where we post and advertise our upcoming events, webinars, and all the information that we produce. And Euraxis worldwide is in the international arm. So as Euraxis China, we belong to this part, and we have other colleagues basically all around the world in Latin America, Oceania, Japan, India, North America, that try also to connect those other parts of the Europe of the world with Europe. How we try to achieve these goals is through different kind of activities. We provide information, and we do it also through our flash notes and newsletter. The second quarterly newsletter will come out very soon. So you're welcome to, again, become part of our community and stay updated by subscribing also to our publications. We create opportunities opportunities for networking in normal times in physical events, but recently we have been trying to also be flexible and innovative. So we experimented with virtual reality and also some online networking softwares that were a lot of fun. So that, you know, is also like a good way to network when COVID doesn't allow for normal networking. We organize webinars such as the one of today, but on very different topics related to science communication, specific funding opportunities, career development. So I think there's a lot of different things that researchers might be interested in. And of course, we organize events, physical and online. So I want to conclude here by inviting those of you who are not yet part of Euraccess China to become a member. You can do it on china.euraccess.org. It's free, and that way you might, you know, get to know about webinars, opportunities to go to Europe, and get to know other researchers that otherwise you might not be able to. Follow us on the social media platform, and I'm going to close it here because I don't want to take too much time from our speaker who is making, you know, the main presentation of today. Before giving her the floor, just a couple of you know, logistics information. We are going to have the presentation, and that is going to be followed by a Q&A session. So we're going to have time to answer all the questions you might have at the very end of this webinar. But during the presentation, feel free, you're welcome to send your questions to the chat box. So just type them in, we collect them, and then we you know, answer to them later. If you're not comfortable doing that in English, you're also welcome to do so in Chinese. You can send your question in Chinese, and our Vanessa Lee will help us with the translation. And I think that's all from my side. If I didn't forget anything, then I will be very happy to give the floor to Laura Wilson, who is with us from Taylor and Francis today, and I'll let her introduce herself and start with the presentation. Welcome, Laura. Thanks for being with us today.
Good afternoon, good morning to everyone. Thank you very much for having me. I'm assuming you can hear me, so I'll share my screen now and get going.
Yes, please. We hear you well.
Excellent. Okay, right. So thank you very much for having me. And today I'm going to talk about publishing ethics. My name is obviously Laura Wilson, and I'm Head of Research Integrity and Ethics at the Taylor and Francis Group. So today we're going to have a brief discussion about publishing ethics, common issues that arise in publishing ethics, and authorship, key ethical declarations you need to consider when you submit a journal article, how publishers ensure the integrity of the scholarly record, and some tips on how to avoid any problems. Just bear with me. Right. So, what is publishing ethics? Publishing ethics is a broad consensus around editorial standards and best practice. This allows publishers and journals to ensure the integrity of the scholarly record, which then ensures that readers can trust what they read and fellow researchers can build upon that published work, knowing it has been fully scrutinized and can be relied upon. Publishers and journals work with a number of societies to develop this framework of ethics, some of which include these images on the right, including the Committee on Publication Ethics, COPE, and the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. So this is an easy slide, hopefully. So who is responsible for the ethics of your research article? You and your co-authors. So what are some of the common issues we see arising as a publisher dealing with journal publication ethics issues? Mainly, we see a lot of authorship disputes, consent to publish issues, plagiarism. On this diagram, those first and second rows, many of these issues arise due to confusion over standards or a lack of understanding of the journal policies, particularly around authorship criteria and non-financial competing interests. That bottom row, these ethical issues are very conscious and deliberate and very serious misconduct that's designed to manipulate the peer review process and the publishing process. It's very unlikely that any of those issues could arise by mistake. To investigate these issues and resolve them involves multiple parties, including the publisher, institution, and sometimes the funder. So firstly, let's talk about authorship. So this is an example of the Taylor and Francis authorship policy. So our policies are influenced by the authorship guidelines set out by the ICMJE, so International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. For someone to be considered an author, they must make a significant contribution to that work, have drafted, written, or critically revised the article, agreed with all and any co-authors about which journal that article should be submitted to, have reviewed all versions of the article at submission, any revised versions, and that final accepted version, and finally, agree to be accountable for that published article. So remember, any listed author is accountable and has to be a representative of that published article and must be able to answer any questions about it post-publication. Generally, it's the corresponding author who completes the publishing agreement on behalf of all the co-authors. Authorship comes with significant responsibilities, and authorship of an article should not be changed post-acceptance. So what are some of the authorship issues we see? So we see gift authorship. So this is where someone who has not made a significant contribution to the article and does not meet the criteria for an article is added to the article. So why is this an issue? Research should be transparent about who was involved. If you have a gift author, this is a dishonest representation of who was actually involved. Anyone, as we said on the previous slide, listed as an author must be accountable for that work and be able to answer questions about that work post-publication. Sometimes we see that someone is added as a gift author without their knowledge as a form of a compliment or to improve the citations of that article by having a big name on the article. If this is discovered post-publication, it can result in institutional involvement and a full investigation. Another ethical issue we see is ghost authorship. So this is where someone makes a significant contribution to the article and meets the criteria for authorship, but is not credited as an author on the published article. So why is that an issue? This is very different to the crafting of an article that a medical writing agency or a translator might do. This is an unethical lack of credit for someone who has made a substantial contribution to the work. It also risks concealing the involvement of someone who may have influenced the research, data analysis, or how those conclusions were made, as well as potentially concealing relevant competing interests. If this is discovered post-publication, it again would require an institutional investigation. So acknowledgements. This is another area where we see issues of acknowledgements going wrong. So for any acknowledgements, authors need to make sure they have the permission of anyone they wish to name in those acknowledgements. Those who are named reserve the right to not have their names included if they don't want them to be. By seeking permission ahead of submitting your article, it allows you to address any authorship issues in advance, as the person you wish to acknowledge may think they deserve to be an author, and this should be resolved before you submit your article to the journal. Another issue that we see or people get confused about is when they've used outsourced lab work or when they've used a medical writing agency. So this is just an example of the Taylor and Francis policy for papers that have outsourced lab work or have used a writing company or translators. If someone has assisted with the experiments or data analysis, this should be clearly stated in your manuscript with a full explanation of their role, and they should be included in the authorship list if they meet those authorship criteria we mentioned earlier. If someone has assisted with writing the article or translating that work, they should be included in the acknowledgements, as well as how their services were paid for. If they meet the criteria for authorship, they should be added. We see a lot of authorship disputes where authors have fallen out about who should be named on the paper, or they don't agree with someone being removed. And these can be particularly tricky because when authorship goes wrong and an authorship dispute arises, this can't be resolved by the publishers or the journal editor. The complainant and the authors all must reach agreement. If they can't reach agreement, their institutions need to be involved. If this were to happen ahead of the article being published, the paper would be put on hold and not proceed to publication. If it happened post-publication, once an agreement has been reached across all of the authors, a correction would be made to the article. Only once everyone is in agreement would anything happen to that article, so we would not publish it until the agreement had been reached. Another issue that publishers and institutions are increasingly seeing is authorship for sale. So this is where someone or a business sells authorship slots on a paper to people who have not been directly involved in the research or the writing of that article. What we have found is that articles that are for sale will generally be fundamentally flawed. So they'll include things like fabricated data, manipulated images, and substantial plagiarism. Or buying authorship slots is highly unethical, and it leads to the publication of unreliable work, and if discovered, can really destroy an author's career. These businesses selling authorship will usually sell the paper to multiple authors, and these will be submitted to multiple journals, all with completely different authorship lists. If discovered, this would result in a retraction of the article, and we'll go into what a retraction means later on, and authors' institutions would be notified. So to summarise, on authorship, if someone meets the criteria for authorship, they should be named as an author. If they don't include them as an author. If someone is named as an author, they should be able to answer any questions about that article post-publication. If you use a translator, medical writing agency, or outsource your lab work, you need to ensure this is credited in your article with a clear statement of the work they did, either as an author or in the acknowledgements. Purchasing authorship is unethical and will result in retractions if discovered. So next, I'm briefly going to talk about ethical considerations for your research and what you need to declare in your submitted article. So, whether your research involves animals, plants, microorganisms, seeds, stem cells, or tissue samples, there are a number of ethical issues you need to consider ahead of starting your research and writing up your article. So, ethical approval. In most cases, you will need ethics approval, and your institution should be the first point of call. Most institutions will have an institutional review board or an ethics committee. If this doesn't exist formally, approach compliance officers, ethics advisors, or even a data protection officer for advice on next steps. If there is no formal framework at your institution, discuss this with your department head. Do not begin your project or research without approval first. When writing or submitting your article, you will need to detail your ethics approval and what you obtained. If you are using animals in your research, before starting, consider the 3 R's. So replacement. Could you replace a higher animal subject with a lower animal, such as invertebrate? Or is it possible to use a non-animal model entirely? Reduction. Could you reduce the number of animals used? Refinement. Can you design the experiment to minimize both suffering of the animal subjects and improve their welfare and care? Ensure before starting that you have the appropriate authorizations and approval for the supply of any animal subjects as well as their use. Ensure that you comply with institutional and national guidelines. And when it comes to writing up your article, be prepared to detail why that animal or species was chosen and how they were used, consideration you have given to those 3 R's, and procedures that ensured the welfare of the animals and any appropriate endpoints. So when it comes to the housing and husbandry of those animal subjects, when detailing that in your article, you need to consider the following. Whilst conducting your research, you should ensure that anyone who interacts with the subject animals is appropriately trained for their role to recognise how to handle that species, but also to recognise any signs of suffering. The welfare of those animals should be at the heart of your research design, and you should make all attempts to minimise their discomfort, infection, illness, and pain, and move quickly if it is recognised that euthanasia is required. It's expected that when you come to submit your article, you can detail how all of this was managed and how you anticipated that impact on those animal subjects and minimise their suffering. Biohazards. If you are working with anything that could be considered a biohazard, please ensure you comply with any institutional policies that there are regarding biohazards, any local legislation, any national policies or legislation regarding biohazards, particularly anything around public health protection. Ensure you have conducted a full risk assessment before starting to ensure you have considered any risks to participants, the general public, or researchers for the duration of that project. Keep a copy of that document. So when dealing with human subjects in clinical evidence, the research could take any of these forms. The ideas around ethics remain the same. Ensure you have cleared ethical approval from your institution before starting. So human participants. At the heart of any research or project design involving human participants, you should consider the following. Respect for those participants and the protection of human dignity, protecting the rights and interests of those participants, ensuring that no element of the research that you have designed is discriminatory or could result in unfair treatment. In your article, you need to detail how you recruited those participants and any inclusion or exclusion criteria. Ethical approval. So again, you must have ethical approval before starting. Where possible, have this clearance from your institutional review board, the IRB. If there's no IRB, speak to a department head or funder. If your ethics board has waived the need for approval, document this, and you will need to include this in your article. Be particularly aware of any variations in legal requirements across countries if you're involved in an international collaboration. Hospitals and institutions may have an extra layer of specific permission requirements, for example, a hospital ethics committee. And when submitting your article, you need to include a full statement of the ethical approval obtained, whether it was obtained or you got a waiver, and you may be asked to supply a copy of this approval as part of the submission process. So informed consent. Informed consent must be documented in all studies involving human participants. So this includes all prospective studies, interviews, focus groups, samples, and parental or guardian consent for children under 16 years old. So for consent to be considered informed, you need to ensure that participants actively consent and understand that their participation is entirely voluntary. When providing the informed consent forms, also provide information sheets that make it clear they can withdraw from the process at any time, that are written in simple language they can understand, that clearly outline the aims of your project and how long you expect the project to take, how their samples may be processed or stored, any expected impacts or potential outcomes for them, will they experience discomfort or anything like that, and how you will use and process their data. Typically, written informed consent should be documented as a written document, but in some cases verbal consent may be more appropriate, and in which case you should explain this when it comes to submitting your article. If you obtain informed consent, please ensure that the documentation is stored securely. Consent to publish. You will need this if you have any identifiable patient or study participant information in your article, or any patient or participant images or recordings. Again, in your document, you'll need to include a statement to confirm you've obtained this and be prepared to provide a copy of this consent to publish if requested by the editor or publisher. For example, this is an example of the Taylor and Francis consent to publish form. So publishers are able to provide documents for use by researchers for cases like this. We may ask for a copy of any consent to publish as part of the editorial process, as I said in the last slide. If we do, this will be stored securely and destroyed when no longer needed. If you're dealing with vulnerable populations, so this would be pregnant women and fetuses, minors, so under that age of 16 or 18 years old, prisoners, persons with diminished mental capacity, and those who are educationally or economically disadvantaged, you need to consider the needs of those participants. So again, coming back to that dignity piece and protecting their rights, and consider their ability to provide full consent. If you're obtaining informed consent from a next of kin or a legal guardian or a carer, you must obtain their consent, but also allow them to monitor the research project or the activity happening to that participant at their request. If you're really struggling with this, your IRB, or again, that framework we discussed, will be able to advise and support on this. Data sets and anonymity. So where possible with your data sets, ensure your participants are anonymized to the fullest extent possible and cannot be identified from your article or their data set. If you cannot anonymize them, consider pseudonyms. If you have purchased a data set from a third-party company, which includes patient data, verify that those data sets may be used for research and the publication thereof. Ensure that you comply with any institutional and national data regulations. Make sure any participants are aware you will be processing data. Have appropriate safeguards on who can access that data. And if you need to transfer data across borders, so from one country to another, discuss that with the person responsible for data at your institution. Ensure that you have a level of security that is appropriate to the nature of the data you're storing. So what we mean by this, that if you have a data set that includes patients' medical data, you should have a higher level of security on that than potentially a data set that indicates people's attitudes towards shopping. And you need to be prepared to detail these considerations as part of the submission process. It may be that after you've submitted your article, the journal asks to see a copy of the raw data set. If you feel there's identifiable information in that data set, please anonymize it before you send it to the publisher or the journal. Most publishers will store that data set securely and delete it as soon as they have concluded the need that they needed to see that data set for. So, as a brief summary on key ethical declarations. So really try to build ethical considerations into the design of your research project. Ensure you have considered any risks or impact. Document those considerations. Obtain approvals or waivers before starting. Keep data and samples stored securely. And you will be asked as part of the editorial process when you submit your article to provide documentation. And you may even be asked for copies of this documentation a year or more after your article has been published. So, competing interests. So this is the Taylor and Francis editorial policy on competing interests. Competing interests are sometimes known as a conflict of interest. People usually associate a competing interest with a really obvious use case, like an author who, for example, has shares in a product and they write a research article that ultimately promotes the success of that product. However, it's not always that obvious. So I've highlighted in yellow the key part, that it's not just what the author may consider to be a competing interest, but what others may perceive as a competing interest. Voluntary involvement, for example, may influence how someone conducts their research and therefore the article they write. And the highlighted bullet points are all things that could be considered a competing interest, but people regularly fail to declare. The most important thing with competing interests is to be transparent And even if you believe it's not a competing interest, it's in your interest to declare it. Undisclosed competing interests can have an impact on published articles if discovered after publication, and that can range from a correction to a retraction. So again, as a brief summary, with competing interests, it's not just about what you think may be a competing interest, but what others may perceive it to be. And the most important thing to be is be fully transparent and just declare anything that could be considered a competing interest. Right, duplicate submissions and publications. So duplicate submission, this is where someone submits the identical same article to multiple journals. So why is this an issue? It's general expected academic practice that you should not submit to more than one journal at the same time. Authors are asked to declare at submission as part of their submission questions that the article isn't under consideration elsewhere. We all know that editor and reviewer time is very valuable. And if two editors and two sets of reviewers are all reviewing the same article, this is a waste of their time. Additionally, authors sign a legally binding agreement ahead of publication, and all those authors are accountable for that agreement. Most publishing agreements will say this article is not under consideration anywhere else, it's not being published anywhere else. If that is not the case, those authors would be in breach of that publishing agreement. You should wait for a journal to make a final decision on a paper before you submit it to another journal. There are certain use cases where duplicate submission or publication can be okay. So for example, if you have an article that was previously published in another language, and this is fully referenced and disclosed to the editor, this can be okay if the editor is happy to proceed and there are no copyright issues such as that original language publisher owning the copyright of that article. Data presented at conferences. This can be okay, short abstracts, as long as it is declared upon submission that that data was made available somewhere else previously. If posted to an institutional repository or a preprint server, this would not be considered prior publication, but should be declared so the editor is aware of any impact that could have on the anonymity of the peer review process. So can a reviewer easily work out the identities of the authors? Things like that. The most important thing when it comes to these use cases is be transparent. Ensure that the editor is aware of any previous versions and can make an informed decision about your article. So plagiarism and text recycling. I'll whiz through these slides because everyone knows what plagiarism is, but plagiarism is the taking of someone else's work and presenting it as your own without referencing, attribution, or credit to that previous person. This can cover the reproduction of any written material, be it a blog, be it a website, be it a journal article. When you write up your article, you should ensure that all sources are fully referenced. If you wish to be certain ahead of submitting your article, you can consider using software such as Authenticate or Crosscheck to double check. If plagiarism is discovered ahead of publication, an article will be rejected. If it's discovered post-publication, depending on the extent of that plagiarism, it can result in a retraction. On this slide, these are some of the misconceptions we hear around plagiarism. So these explanations really can highlight the misconceptions, but also different standards around the world regarding duplication and plagiarism, particularly at the institutional level versus that publisher level. And this is something that journals and publishers are really working to do to provide consistent guidance and consistent policies so that we can take an educational approach, because all journals and publishers ultimately want to do is publish that research. So let's try and avoid some of these issues, particularly when they're innocent error. If we do, as I said on the previous slide, if we found substantial plagiarism in an article, we would be looking at retracting it. So self-plagiarism. This is the process of repeating one's own work across multiple articles, and it's sometimes known as text recycling. This is an issue because it can give the impression that you have lots of novel findings because you're publishing loads of different articles, when in fact you are both taking up valuable publication space and recycling material where other people could have their own original articles published, but also it can lend credence to your findings, weight them more heavily, when in fact it's just the same findings repeated across multiple articles. It can also cause copyright issues. If you've assigned copyright or granted a license on that portion of text or that figure previously, technically you may need to clear permission before you can use it again. Publishers and journals fully understand that you may wish to build on previously published work. However, you need to ensure this is fully referenced and that the editor is aware portions have been previously published so that they can make an informed decision. Again, if this is discovered ahead of publication, it can result in a rejection. If it's discovered post-publication and it's a substantial amount, this could result in a retraction. We fully appreciate that this is quite a grey area and quite difficult for researchers. So there's a new project called the Text Recycling Project, which is aiming to give guidance and collate guidelines for researchers about how to refer to their previously written work and how to build upon that previously published work. And what I would say is, if you're ever in doubt, have a look at these guidelines and refer back to your institutional funder guides about how much of previously published works you can use. So next, on to ensuring, how do publishers ensure the integrity of the scholarly record? So one of the things that many people don't realise is that when an article is published, it becomes part of the scholarly record, and publishers and journals have a duty to preserve it. So as we've moved on to the online world, I think it's given the impression that we can delete content a lot easier, when in fact the academic publishing principles remain the same as if it was a hard copy book, where once it's published, you can't destroy the book because everyone's got a copy, but how can we amend that article? So to correct an article, we may introduce a correction notice or retract it. Other options are also including expressions of concern or removal of an article, and I'll come to these a little bit later. In all cases, post-publication notices are attached to the original article permanently on the publisher database and anywhere that article has been distributed. Correction notices are really focused about being factual. They won't blame anyone. They shouldn't be a place for what we in England we would say airing your dirty laundry. So it shouldn't be about who did that, it's to basically correct that article so that someone knows what has happened to the article when they come to read it. So a correction notice is generally used where there was an error or omission in the original published article. An author can request a correction to their article. And when we consider issuing a correction notice, for that to be valid, the overall conclusions must still be true and valid, and there should be no wider ethical concerns about that article. So here's an example from our database of a correction notice. So as you can see, the original article was published with an error in this table. So the correction notice serves to clarify the correct version of that table so that any reader using it knows they should use the table that's in the correction notice and not what may have been in a previous version. So a retraction notice. So this is the most serious notice a publisher can add to an article. So we will use a retraction notice where there is a substantial breach of publication ethics or how that research was conducted. So we'll see this a lot where, say, someone didn't obtain informed consent from human participants, or animal welfare guidelines were breached in how that research was conducted. Or this can be where there was an honest error, where the authors realise it needs retraction as the findings are no longer valid or reliable. So this may be where they've used the wrong data set to generate their fundings. It's important to note that authors can request retractions of their own articles, and if they do so, this would be reflected in the wording of the retraction notice. Journals do not need to wait for authors or institutions to respond if there is sufficient evidence of the issues in that article. And again, as I said previously, the contents of any retraction notice will be entirely factual and will not attribute blame. One of the myths about retraction is that when an article is retracted, it gets removed from the database. This is not the case. The article will remain in place on the database with a retraction watermark across it, and a retraction notice will generally appear on the abstract page of the article. So as an example, this is a retraction statement. So as you'll notice, the editors and publisher have retracted this. And the authors basically were asked about the integrity of their data. The publisher and the journal asked for an explanation, and they confirmed that there were errors, and therefore they agreed to the retraction and they've apologized. So this is a collaborative retraction statement where everyone is in agreement that it needed retracting. An expression of concern. So this is where we issue a notice that basically acts as a bit of a reader beware, there may be something wrong with this article. So we'd use this where an investigation is taking a long time, but we want to make researchers aware there may be issues. Any notice that we add to the article is permanent. So whilst the expression of concern may never be removed, if we can resolve the investigation or the issue, we may add an update to that notice to basically say everything's actually fine. So here's an example of an expression of concern. So again, the publisher and the editor of the journal are issuing this notice. And basically, this is because we haven't received a response from the authors to confirm the integrity of the article, and that we continue to work on this investigation. So removal or retraction. So sometimes we may need to use a removal or withdrawal notice as opposed to a retraction. And generally we use a retraction where there's ethical misconduct. Removal or withdrawal is generally where the article is subject to a court order or serious legal concern. It poses a significant breach of privacy of any of the people involved in the article or the subjects in the article. Or, and this is the most common one, it poses a great risk of harm to the public, such as it recommends a specific treatment for a condition which does not work or poses actual harm. Where we remove content, a notice will be put in its place explaining why. So here's an example. So it was withdrawn for legal reasons. And before I go into the top tips, I just wanted to give a little bit of a slide of things to be really careful of, because we are starting to see many unscrupulous businesses who are waiting to take advantage of researchers when they're looking at where to publish their article or how to publish their article. So when considering where you submit your article to, please choose your publication outlet really carefully. Be mindful of anyone who you don't know or a journal you haven't heard of before who approaches you directly asking you to submit to their publication, or who offers you a prize if you pay them a certain amount of money. Be really cautious of submission agents, particularly if they approach you via WeChat or anything like that. Again, purchasing authorship is unethical. If anyone approaches you offering you an authorship slot on a paper that you haven't contributed to, or the research that you have no knowledge of, do not take them up on that offer. If you haven't heard of a journal before that you discover online or who approach you, speak to your colleagues, but also use tools like Think, Check, Submit. Also be really careful about conferences that guarantee publication. These probably won't be journals you want to publish in. And ultimately, when you're approached with any of these kind of approaches or issues, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. So I'm almost done, I promise. But finally, just some brief tips on how to avoid problems. So again, with authorship, and I cannot say this enough, ensure that everyone has agreed on authorship before you even submit the article, and that everyone is clear of their responsibilities. Tip 2, always preserve and store those original data sets. You may be asked for them both during the review process or even potentially post-publication if an issue arises. Tip 3, ensure that you have complied with institutional, local and national requirements in all of your research, as well as those editorial guidelines and policies of the journal you're submitting to. When considering competing interests or anything like that, be as transparent as possible. Ensure you have been clear about those competing interests, any institutional review board approval, ethics statements, funding information, and acknowledge anyone who was involved. When using any third-party sources, please ensure that any sources are fully referenced. If your article has been deposited anywhere previously, ensure this is referenced. If you've used any third-party material, such as a figure or a table from another article, ensure this is fully cited and you've cleared permission as appropriate, and be really transparent upon submission to the editor about any previous versions of the work. And if you're applying for funding for your research and you're not sure how to answer an ethics question, speak to your peers, speak to your head of department and refer to those funder guidelines. They want you to apply for this funding, so they will have clear guidelines. You just need to dig them out and have a look. When submitting any funding proposals, ensure that you are as transparent as possible about anything relating to ethics. And what I would really say is it's much better to address these issues before starting your research, and by having all of these considerations documented before you even start. So showing you've done that risk assessment, showing that you've got those ethics approvals, that you considered the impact on any participants or those animal subjects. It will make your research project go much more smoothly, and it's reassuring to the funder that you've considered all of these elements. And from a publisher perspective, it will really save time when you write up your article and submit it, because we won't need to ask any of the questions because you have it already with your submission and detailed in your article. So I know that was a lot of slides, so thank you ever so much. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Laura. Wait, is the audio okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I hear echo, but I think it's just my own problem. So thank you very much for this presentation. I thought it was really very interesting, and especially for me and for those other participants who joined the previous webinar that we organized on publishing in academic articles with your colleague as well from Taylor Francis. It was very interesting because we started touching upon some of the elements you talked about today, but it was really a big dive today. And also, you know, for those participants who might be maybe applying for European funding, I think really this provides a nice overview and a lot of tips on how to avoid problems. If I was about to publish an article myself, I would definitely have taken a lot of notes today, and you know, starting like considering about ethics and integrity really before starting writing down my article. So that was really very interesting, and I'm sure also for our audience today. However, I think you have been very, very clear and provided a lot of examples, because I didn't see any question that we received through the presentation. So I'm just going to ask if anyone in the audience would like even to just ask a question directly to our speaker today. We can unmute you and you can show your face and ask your question directly, or just type it in. Because we haven't received questions. It really means that you were super clear and your presentation was very dense.
And what I would say is I'll share the presentation slides obviously with you, Anna, but my email address is on there. And if you have a specific question or a specific use case that you're not sure about, please email me and I'm happy to answer or point you in the direction of who you might need to speak to.
Thanks a lot. That was very nice of you. We will make sure to share your PowerPoint presentation, and also we will share the recording of this webinar to those who might want to watch it again or those who were not able to join today. So it's going to be available on our platforms, and you know, it will stay available as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you very, very much for your time. And yeah, it was a true honor. So thank you.
Thanks a lot once more. It was really great for us to have you here today, and we will stay in touch.
Yes, yes, please. Oh, we've got a question. So if I finished a research paper while I am with institution A, but I published it while I'm in institution B, then which institution should I affiliate my paper with? This is a very good question and something that people get very confused about. So the general principle is that your affiliation should be where you conducted that research and the research that the institution that funding was awarded to. So what I would recommend in that case is your affiliation is institution A, but then you could cite institution B in the acknowledgements or your author bio, or some journals will allow you to have a secondary affiliation. You just need to make it clear where you did the research.
Wonderful. That was an interesting question indeed. Anyone else? That was the last question. I see. Thank you. Okay, there's Adamu Bala who is asking, is this necessary to publish additional data on my research together as a separate publication?
So again, this is a very good question and something that I think publishers, journals, institutions and funders are getting a bit more interested in. What I would say is that I think it's always great to be transparent and share your additional data with services like Figshare, people like that, include a link to it when you submit your article. But I think the most important thing to do is check your institutional policies. Do they have an expectation about where you share any additional data? But also when you choose the journal you want to publish your article to, look at their guidelines. Did they have a specific data deposit policy? And that should really inform your decision.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very clear. And yeah, I guess one of the first steps is always to check with your own institution. So in the meantime, another question came in. I was wondering if there are any training sessions or nationwide guidelines for ethic clearance. In my institution, clearance is just the paperwork mostly, but I think I need to know a bit more about what to pay attention to. This coming from Dio.
Again, that's a very interesting question. So I think on the whole, across most institutions, clearance is just a sort of paperwork formality going through the process. What I would recommend is speaking to your institution. If you have an ethics officer or a compliance officer who knows more about ethics approval or anything like that, speak to them about, are there any national specific guidelines or any training programs you could find out more? That would be my best advice on that front.
Thank you. Yeah, I am not aware of specific guidelines that we have in China, but in case we can try to get this information. And yes, we will be sharing slides and also the recording later. You will find everything available on our portal at china.euraccess.org. So you can have a look later, and anyway, you can reach us and we will put you in contact with Laura or anyone else who might be able to, or will try to at least reply to your question or doubts.
Excellent, thank you.
Thanks a lot again, Laura. It was wonderful, and I wish we will have more opportunities to organize events together.
I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks everybody for joining, and thanks Halder and Vanessa for your support today.
Thank you everyone. Bye, have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.